Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to see so many of you here today for a fantastic guest and a great conversation to happen. My name is Bryan Alexander. I'm the Future Trends Forum's creator. I'm your host, and I'll be your cat herder for the next hour of conversation. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Alfie Kohn. Alfie is, among other things, a prolific writer and a lecturer. He's also just widely known. He's appeared everywhere from Oprah to multiple venues on television, radio, and print. He is a provocative thinker about education, and he's focused on K through 12 as well as higher education. And I'd like to welcome him today to talk to us about, and to talk with us about how we can improve teaching and learning in academia. So without any further ado, let me bring him up on stage. Hello, Alfie.
Hello, nice to be here.
Very glad to see you here. Where are you coming to us from today?
The Boston area.
Okay. Do you still have snow on the ground, or is spring starting to appear?
Neither.
You have slush, cold slush?
No, the snow is gone, but it's a chilly day.
Oh, very good. Well, I hope you stay warm. I know in Boston this is like a perpetual challenge. Alpha, we have so many ways to introduce people in academia, and our favorite way here to introduce people is to ask them to describe what they're going to be working on for the next year. What are the big projects, and what are the big ideas that are going to be taking up most of your mind and your time?
Trying to be more productive than I was the preceding year. That's one meta goal, I suppose. Hopefully being able to see people again in presentations and workshops in 3 dimensions, which would be nice. Be nice to be back to be challenged and to challenge others at a venue where I have to wear pants. One of the projects I'm working on now, I've been working on and off, is something that will either be a very long article or a short book that challenges a particular set of beliefs about how kids learn, that talks about the overemphasis, I believe, that has been paid to simple knowledge, a bunch of facts transmitted, and to pull together the evidence to show that it's not quite that simple, and to push back against many of the traditionalists who themselves have waged war against a progressive or constructivist approach to teaching and learning. Other than that, I write short pieces on my blog all the time about whatever happens to pop into my head.
Well, and if you haven't seen that blog, by the way, friends, look in the bottom left of the screen. There's a kind of tan-colored box that says Alfie Kohn homepage. Click that, and guess what you'll get? Among other things.
You'll actually get a version of it that's modified for phone use, incidentally. If you're on a computer, you'll find, I think, the layout somewhat more congenial if you go through a website to the standard approach.
I see that. That's interesting. That goes right to alfiekohn.org.
Yeah, there's something about your machinery that's leads the website to interpret it as a mobile device. I don't know why, but heck, I can't be particular. I'm happy to have any visit on any modality to my website.
Well, and everyone, please do visit. Friends, if you're new to the forum, I usually start off by asking our guest a couple of questions to get the ball rolling. But the purpose of the forum is for your questions to be asked, for your comments to be heard. So remember, I'm just going to start things off, but please use that, click that raised hand button if you'd like to join us on stage, or just type in the Q&A box. And just to begin with, you're thinking about the past year when productivity was challenged, as you say. Are there any lessons about learning and teaching that we can draw from the past year that we should?
Oh boy. I don't know are you back? Am I back? Nope, still frozen.
A second, there we go. This seems to happen once a time. We get a gremlin who decides to knock me off the stage. So the question was, I don't know if you got to hear all of it, but what lessons can we apply to the future of teaching and learning based on the weird experience of the past year?
You just inadvertently provided an answer to your own question there. The risk of over-reliance on technology. And not just because we freeze up or because it's a pain in the ass, but because genuine teaching and learning requires human contact. So the fact that it's easier and some ways cheaper for institutions to rely on distance instruction. I would never say distance learning because that presupposes that actual learning is taking place, is problematic. And so that would be a negative lesson, is let's not assume that this should continue forever when it's not justified in terms of what really helps people develop intellectually, socially, morally, and so on. I wrote a piece for Education Week last year called The Pandemic Pivot, speaking mostly to K-12 educators, but some of the lessons apply here, to talk about what we affirmatively should do, which is to take some of the things that have been done of necessity during the pandemic and reconsider the reasons for that and why we should continue doing them. One is there's been a moratorium on K-12 standardized tests for the most part. A second is there's been a drastic decline in the use of standardized exams to get into college, like the SATs and ACTs, because it's simply not fair, given the inequities in our society, differential access to broadband and so on, to use these tests. And then third, a number of colleges and universities, as well as K-12 schools, have suspended grading or did just a pass-fail. And my argument is, when someone asks me, how do I feel about that grades, because they know my views on grades, I replied, how would you feel if the CIA announced that they were temporarily suspending waterboarding prisoners because of a drought? I mean, yeah, I'm glad to see it stop for as long as possible for whatever reason. But the didn't mean to make you choke there. But the important point here is that standardized testing of any kind, including but not limited to college admission, and grades have never made sense. And so that, hence the use of the word pivot. What we need to do is take advantage of this opportunity to remind people of the fact that the rationale for not doing these things is not a superficial or temporary artifact of the COVID pandemic, and thus we should continue not to do this forever for more enduring and important reasons.
That's a fantastic phrase, and if I'm getting a little here. But that's a fantastic way of putting it. And friends, if you're new to Alfie's work, he's a major critic of grading. And in fact, let me bring up our first question that comes up along with that. Let me bring up Tom Hames, coming to us from Katy, Texas. Tom has a question about the pernicious impact of grades.
So now, a fan of your work. I'm definitely on your side as far as grades, as both a teacher and a theoretician of trying to figure out how the system works. I have, one of my big things is always going to be looking at systems and structures and culture. And one of the things that I've struggled against, obviously, as a teacher on a teacher's level, is the fact that my students are conditioned to think a certain way about grades. The system demands that I spit out grades in a certain way. Mm-hmm. The system equates achievement and completion, and all these other things are linked to grades. How do we undo this furball? I mean, this has only gotten worse, and this is not a new thing. I mean, this is a relatively new thing. It's only been around in the way we understand it today, since the 50s and 60s, maybe, right? So how do we start to unravel this Gordian knot of grades on a systemic level? Because as a teacher, it's incredibly demotivating and disheartening to try to fight against the current on that.
Yes, absolutely. First, let me just by way of overview say that I'm happy to spend as much time talking with all of you about grades as you'd like. But that's not the only thing that I write and speak about, including at the level of higher education, where I'm equally concerned about challenging other aspects of the status quo,
Sure.
about the need for students to play a role in designing the course, about the need for teaching and learning to reflect deep understanding and construction of meaning rather than mere memorization of facts, about the need to move away from lectures, and tests, including instructor design tests. Happy to talk about any of those things. Let me take a step back, though, with your question and the offhand chance that not everybody shares your and my premise and sympathies on this question to say the following. Research on grades at all levels, from elementary school to graduate school, find three robust effects of giving grades of any kind, including the cutesy kind that we think are slightly better because they represent a minor repair of the status quo, like standards-based grading and other things like that. And so if we were to take a large group of students, give them all identical assignments, and then randomly assign them to group one, where they're told they're going to get a grade for this, and group two, where they're told there's no grade involved, you would find on average three differences between the groups. First, students who are given grades become less interested in whatever they're learning. I'm not aware of any study at any age level or in any culture that has failed to find that difference. Grades undermine, by their very existence, intrinsic motivation in the specific topic or task, in the discipline, and in learning itself. Second, students who are given grades, or worse, led to focus a lot on grades by having them pushed into their faces, tend to pick the easiest possible task if given a choice. Not because they're lazy, not because they lack a growth mindset, which is an anti-systemic phenomenon we can talk about, but because they understand. It's rational. Duh, if the point in here is to get an A or a 100, then I am going to avoid intellectual risk-taking whenever possible, because the goal is to maximize the grades. And the third effect is that students who are focused on grades tend to think in a shallower, a more superficial way than students lucky enough to be in classrooms, or better yet, institutions where there are never letter or number grades involved. Now, the absence of grades, I believe, is necessary for promoting intrinsic motivation, preference for challenging tasks, and deeper thinking, but not sufficient. Hence my overview about the need to attend to other stuff that we need to do. So whenever there's something that is problematic, I believe in moving in two tracks at once. One is, in the short run, what can I, as an individual instructor, do to minimize the damage? Simultaneously, and this I think, and I'm happy to hear it, I believe the focus of your question, what can we do at a systemic or institutional level to change the status quo, rather than treating, for example, the need that I need to turn in grades for my students as being like the weather, just a fact of life to which we have to accommodate ourselves. So the answer to the first question is, if you work at an institution where you have to turn in a grade, at the end, you can do two things. One is you can make grades as invisible as possible for as long as possible to students, which means never putting a letter or number on any individual assignment, even if you have to turn in a grade at the end of the term. If you grade individual assignments, you are part of the problem. You are accentuating and accelerating the damage caused by bad institutional decisions. And the second thing you can do at an individual level is, even though they require you to turn in a grade at the end, they don't require you to make that decision unilaterally. And so what I find the best, most humanistic, thoughtful, and intellectually rigorous instructors do is they meet briefly with every student, talk about the important stuff of how the class is going, and then say at the end, oh, I have to put down a grade for you. What should it be? This is an enormous gesture of both respect and trust that may be the most powerful lesson that kids take away from that course. And incidentally, virtually everybody I've ever talked to who does this says that students almost invariably pick about the same grade that the instructor would have picked too, sometimes even a lower one. And if you get one kid out of 80 who picks a higher grade and you're thinking, you don't deserve that, So what? Let it go. Big deal. The good you've done here
Right.
in rescuing learning more than compensates for a single kid who took advantage. Now, to speak to the institutional level question, you need to organize and mobilize the way you make all kinds of systemic change. You need to start by spreading the word to help other instructors come to your level of understanding about the damage that grades do. The problem is not grade inflation. The problem is grades. Or to put it differently, the problem is not too many students getting A's. The problem is too many students being led to think that getting A's is the point of going to school. And if the attempt to make things more rigorous by limiting the number of grades, good grades that are given, intensifies the problem by making students focus even more on this. Most instructors who are not in the field of, say, psychology or education, and sadly even some of them, have never even been introduced to the difference between intrinsic motivation, which means doing something because you get a kick out of it and find it meaningful, and extrinsic motivation, which means you do something to get a reward or avoid a punishment. Much less do most instructors, even in the humanities and social sciences, let alone the natural sciences, much less do they understand one of the most powerful findings in social psychology in the last 50 years, which I will now compress into a single sentence, something never before attempted on Shindig, 100 studies in one sentence. The more you reward people for doing something, the more they tend to lose interest in whatever they had to do to get the reward. Hence the finding about grades in particular, which is a subset of extrinsic motivators, consistently showing that if you want kids not only to learn a bunch of chemistry or sociology or literature, you want them to kind of see the beauty in playing with these ideas and take that with them. Anytime you give them a grade, you make that less likely to happen. Do you motivate them this way? Well, that's the wrong question. The response is, what kind of motivation have you promoted? And the answer is extrinsic, normally at the expense of intrinsic. So the first message is spread the word to your administrators and your colleagues, and engage in conversations with the students themselves, who may react with existential vertigo if grades are suddenly taken away. Well, if I'm not a B+, who am I? And that's, or why should I bother doing the reading if there's no grade involved? That's not a reason to continue damaging them with grades. That's a reflection of how much damage has already been done. And thus, you don't just, first that people did grades to them and now they're doing the abolition of grades to them. You need to shift from a doing to a working with model, so that you are eliciting from them their experiences and helping them to realize that we are going to create a learning-centered classroom, not a grade-centered classroom, and then we're all going to work to do the same with the whole university.
Right. So, I mean, my frustration with that is that my students, when they come to me, I teach community college, so I'm not getting the best on the whole students coming out of the system. I have a lot of, first-time college students. Yeah, no, I know. They don't have the benefits that a lot of other folks do in terms of having that separation between learning and school. They don't understand what they're doing. My frustration is if I don't incentivize things for them, they literally don't do them. And over the course of the semester, I'm trying to get them to build knowledge and projects. And I'm very big on formative assessment. And so they get points for doing skill things, right?
I hope not. I hope not starting tomorrow, because points are doggy biscuits too. And every time you give them a point,
I know exactly what I'm doing there.
Less excited about the learning.
I understand what I'm doing there.
And then you point to their attitude that you've helped to underscore to justify your continuation of giving them this poison, and it's a vicious circle.
Right.
So the question is,
if I don't incentivize them to engage early, they will let everything pile up at the end of the semester, and they will not. They can't process it fast enough. There's a long, careful learning curve I'm trying to build into my class, and those students, I have students who check out for weeks at a time, and then feel like they can jump back on the train, and the train's already in the next town. And it's not about content; it's about skill levels. I'm trying to get them to do, problem set definition, analysis, and and build over the course. They have a challenge over the course of the entire semester.
So I don't want to put you on the spot here with a particular
Yeah.
question and do a sort of private consultation. I want to bring in other people, but I will ask these general questions, invite you and others to think of these general questions. Sure. First, how much say do the students have about the curriculum? Not only about the pacing, not only about how many problems and when they're due and what point value is assigned, but what specific skills they're learning, in what way, with whom, and for what purpose. My prediction is the more you made those decisions unilaterally, even before meeting them with a specific syllabus, perhaps,
right,
the more likely they are going to be to say, where's my incentive? Otherwise, I have no reason to do that. Whereas sure. I have found instructors willing to divest themselves of some power and bring students into the process of devising the course. This kind of instructors who do a lot less telling and a lot more asking find that even students from very traditional backgrounds and with very pre-professional mindsets are more likely to find the learning itself engaging. Sometimes it's a function of the whole society we live in. Sometimes it's a function of institutional requirements. Sometimes it's a function of individual personalities or lack of background on the student's part. But a heck of a lot of times I find the problem is with the curriculum and the pedagogy and the absence of opportunity for the students to participate in both, which is then used as an excuse to perpetuate the very extrinsic devices that undermine both the quality of learning and the interest in learning. So I would want to visit someone's classroom if I was consulting with them before I shrug my shoulders and say, oh, well, you got to give them points, otherwise they're not going to do it or they're going to put it off, to see just what they're learning and how and the extent to which they were brought into the process before I agree with you that there's no alternative to incentivize them, which is strictly speaking not even a word, but even if it were, it's a word that makes my skin crawl. So I'm
with you on that. And that's my frustration is squaring the circle on it. My students pick their own challenges and I build the class around their challenges. So what they're interested in, and then I graft everything onto that. It's just the incentivization part of it is to try to get them to do the ground level work that's necessary to do that higher level work. I don't know another way to get them to do it, to be honest.
And I'm glad you ended that with, I don't know another way to do it, rather than saying it can't be done a different way.
I freely admit I don't know what the hell I'm doing sometimes.
So that's saying, somebody offer me some coaching so that I can embed the skills in a more engaging, student-directed form of learning, bereft of any kind of extrinsic motivators, the way I have found talented teachers at all levels figuring out, and which I am not as good at as they are, but I know it can be done. One last point on this before we bring in somebody else. A book was just
I don't want to hug
published.
The stage too much.
Was just no, it's more my fault. I'm doing too much more of the talking than you. But in December,
that's the point.
A few months ago, a new book was published. I want to make sure everybody knows about it, called Ungrading, edited by Susan Bloom, B-L-U-M, the first book on this exact topic ever intended specifically for higher education folks. I was asked to write the foreword for this collection, and that foreword that I wrote, which is all about pushing people who already sort of agree that grades aren't great to the next level, that's the purpose of my foreword, is also available on my website. But I invite you, after sampling that appetizer, to go for the whole meal and look for the book itself, just called Ungrading. It contains a number of chapters by people who are more moderate than I am and offer other sort of what I consider to be half measures of ways of moving away from grading incrementally without getting rid of it entirely. You may find the account of their journeys to resonate with you.
Thank you.
That we should invite to the program. Tom, thank you. And thank you for being so transparent about your process, as always. Alfie, you wanted to talk about topics in higher education other than grading, I know, but we had a couple of quick questions, very precise ones about this. And then
I'm happy to talk about that if that's what people want to.
And then a couple that really open out into other topics. One was a question about scale. Sama Foster asked, I've done this in small courses, but how do you do this in large lecture courses with hundreds of students?
Well, if the this refers only to grading as opposed to moving away from lectures and giving students more say about the course to plan together, if it's just about grades, yeah. No, look, I work with also high school teachers who have sometimes a ridiculous course load, with, multiple preps and 150 students over the course of a day. And they say that they can't, first of all, there's a problem with the learning from groups that big. That really argues against that for reasons that go beyond how assessment is done. But you do what you can with the time you have. I don't know if you have teaching assistants who can help with some of the process as well. If so, put them to work on an authentic assessment in place of tests and grades, rather than just putting them to work with the usual traditional tasks. But you can't meet with X students, if there are many of them, for as long as you'd like to, if they're large courses. But you can still, I'd rather give no assessment than to give a multiple choice test, because multiple choice tests measure what matters least, intellectually speaking. And I'd rather give no feedback at all than to give a letter grade, which isn't merely ineffective, it is actively counterproductive. But in various ways, and some of the contributors to the book on grading I just mentioned talk about how they've managed this with large courses, is to figure out ways where you can make a brief comment on what students do, but still avoid the damage done by giving a letter or number.
Thank you. That's a very, very concise and rich answer to a very solid question. Related to that question was a question about gender from Leslie Harris, who asks, some research shows that women will tend to rate themselves more critically, and as students, they will give themselves lower grades compared to their male counterparts. That was a statement. I guess the implicit question is, well, what do you do about this?
You make it transparent. What an interesting discussion for the whole class. That even if the class is not gender studies, I don't care if it's chemistry, to talk briefly about that and to invite folks, when they are inevitably going to be invited to reflect on their experience, to correct for any tendency they may have to understate, or just as problematic, overstate the question of how well they've done. And so that assumes, of course, that they're going to have to give a grade to themselves at the end. And if you, in your conversations where they have to pick that final grade, sense that they may be either under or overvaluing themselves, if you have enough time, you engage them a bit about that. You become, a friendly critic. Tell me more, about that, and tell me in the context of your life whether you have a tendency to think you're always terrific even when other people don't agree, or you're always crappy and you're an imposter and everybody else knows what they're doing and I'm the one who's faking it. You could talk about some of that with the whole class and some of it as necessary with individuals, but it certainly shouldn't lead you to forego the process of eliciting the students' views and letting them have the final decision. Because you're deciding their fate unilaterally with a top-down model is bad no matter what your gender is.
Thank you. That's a terrific answer, a very democratic, lowercase d answer as well. We have a couple of observations rather than questions, but I did want to share them that came in. This one came in from Beth Benedict's. A rhetorical question, rather. Why don't we start with the assumption that our students want to learn? Because they do. They don't have to be incentivized to learn. We need to de-incentivize power. So I wanted to share that with you. And then we had one from my colleague, Molly Chehak, who says, in case your ears were burning, I would love to get that guy off the stage. And we are doing a teaching circle through candles based around Blum's book. So you have another fan there, at least in terms of Blum's book right there.
What get this guy, which guy off which stage?
I think that was Tom, because she wanted to get her point across.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Now,
Unclear referent. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
indeed, but things are moving quickly, and we have a lot of fans, a lot of applause coming up, and a lot of questions. But some of the questions, if I can, friends, I need to combine these into one. People were asking about a kind of cultural question that faculty are really interested in grading, but also they expect it. Ben Rifkin says the students have been socialized to expect grades. Eric Fournier said something like this. Beth Benedict's asked, how do you get colleagues to understand this, especially when their own identities are wrapped up in the old ways? So I guess this is a kind of revolution or reform question. How do you do this in higher ed?
Well, it's as tough as it is with your students who've already had many years of socialization. At least you have them for an extended period of time. And so inviting them to participate in discussions where you ask them about their experience with grades and related topics of their schooling is easier to do than get your colleagues, because you don't have them as a captive audience for a period of time, and also because they have a professional investment in doing what is often bad for learning. Some of them do this, though, and just as we want to assume the best, as that woman just said, why not assume the best about students and their desire to learn? Why not, just trying this on as a thought experiment, assume the best about many of our colleagues, that they've just never had an opportunity to reflect on this. A vast number of people with PhDs literally do not understand that extrinsic motivators undermine intrinsic motivation, or even that those two are completely different things, and that it would never make sense to say, but grades motivate kids, because that statement conflates the two qualitatively different kinds of motivation. Nobody ever told them that. And here's another broader point that I don't have to tell people in academia. A lot of people didn't really get a PhD and a university job in order to teach. Teaching for many people is like an occupational hazard. They don't like it. They're not that good at it. Nobody ever showed them how to do it well. They're in this for research, especially at R1 universities, and they have to teach courses. And they may not, let's just be very clear about this. You can be one of the world's most extraordinary biologists or historians or literary critics and not know anything about how to help children or university-age students learn biology or history or literary criticism. That is an entirely separate field to understand that we do not merely transmit information to passive receptacles.
Right.
That notion of instruction is passé and yet continues to pervade our campuses, in part because research counts far more for tenure and promotion than does teaching, because people are rarely given instruction up to date in how human beings are not passive receptacles, but are active meaning makers. And even if you understand the theory of teaching and learning, the cognitive science and pedagogy behind this, you may say, as the previous questioner did, I need help. I don't know how to do this. All I know is lecturing. I was lectured at when I was an undergrad and when I was in grad school, except for the occasional seminar courses. I'm not that great at that, but at least I can be entertaining and I have my notes in front of me. One of my favorite books about pedagogy in higher education is by a guy named David Finkel, called Teaching with Your Mouth Shut. And there are other books and resources available that tell you how and why lecturing should form a very, very small component of your total hours with students, and what you do instead of tests to see how successful things are, what you do instead of lectures and just assigning textbook chapters and so on, in order to help students make sense of ideas. So many of our colleagues need help with the resources and the skills to become good teachers, which is completely separate from their expertise in their respective areas. To become teachers of students, not teachers of political science, or whatever the discipline is. And to figure out there are other, or like my sort of glib comment about syllabi, when you stop to think about it, if you know anything about meaningful teaching and learning, the idea that you would prepare a detailed syllabus ahead of time before you even met the students implies that who they are, what they know, what they want to know is irrelevant. You're treating them all as interchangeable. It's like I used to teach a course on existentialism for 7 years. Years ago, I loved this course. I would take it out between terms and polish it up like a car. You know, I couldn't wait to do this course again. And it was only years later that I realized, how could I do this? Well, the idea that I have a course ready to go when the students arrive is like, it's like a single person saying, I have this great marriage ready to go. I just need to find somebody to have it with. You know, it represents a fundamental, something that is, I think, presumptuous and dismissive without ever meaning to be so. The idea that you simply provide information to students, whoever they are. And so if you've never heard that before, if you've never been goosed with subversive ideas like this, of course you're going to cling for dear life to what's easiest. And in a lot of universities, you know, what instructors do is they say, you know, all right, here's the way it's going to go here. I'm going to tell you what to read. I'm going to make you listen to me lecture. I'm going to make you cough back information on a test. And then at the end, we'll pretend that I taught and that you learned.
I have a quick question about that. Do you think centers for teaching and learning are a good avenue for helping faculty in this right now?
If they're doing it right. If they're asking the radical questions, by which I mean from the Latin radical, from the root questions, not how do we tweak our multiple choice tests or become better lecturers, but if they're asking the good questions, yeah, I've seen some amazing, you know, at Harvard, at Case Western, at a lot of places, they have these centers that are really thoughtful. Of course, the people who sign up to be part of that are typically the people who are already pretty damn good and just getting better. But I don't think most universities do those, or at least do them thoughtfully or extensively.
That's what I've been wondering about the past year, if it has shaken things up. But I'm much more interested in the questions that have come up from everybody here, and they're coming thick and fast. We did have a bunch of technical questions about online teaching, not about bandwidth, but about how learning management systems drive you towards grading and not. That hasn't appeared as a question yet. I just want to flag that as a topic, which is very interesting. But then we have one from Leslie Harris, which actually has to do with contract grading. What do you think of that as a kind of compromise in which individual items aren't graded, but there is still a grade at the end of a course?
I would do that as a kind of scaffolding for instructor and student alike for a little while if you find it necessary, and then get the hell out of there, because it's still grading and it doesn't address any of the 3 fundamental research findings about why grading, even contract grading, undermines the things that we want to promote.
Very good. I'm conscious of time here, everybody, and I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to ask. And that's a great question. And Alfie, as always, I admire the precision of these answers as well as their generosity. We have a completely different question, but I think it's one that's actually quite thoroughly linked, from Shinli Wang. One of the lessons learned is that we should invest in professional development for people to become better teachers. But the trend in higher education is more precarious labor, less permanent jobs. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a tenured track researcher, your problem may be that teaching is not a priority for you, but it's a very different set of barriers, economic and systemic. I mean, what is it now? Less than a quarter of all people teaching in colleges and universities are tenured or tenure track, increasingly for purely financial reasons. Nothing to do with what's beneficial to students. It's all underpaid, abused adjuncts. And their challenge in trying to be the best teacher they possibly can is limited by other constraints. And yeah, no, I understand the gravity of what we're up against here. And that's why it's so important to point out that every dollar saved on a cheaper, overworked adjunct is at the expense of the quality of the university. But, you know, we have big macro level questions about that perhaps you've addressed with other guests on your show, starting with the fact of how we evaluate not only instructors, but how we look upon what is a good college or university. Like, to start with, selectivity is not the same thing as quality. We tend to judge universities by how many applicants they manage to avoid admitting, which makes no sense. Anyway,
from numerous points of view, and it's a great topic. And Shinley, I'm really glad that you mentioned this. And this makes the challenge in some ways more difficult. But related to that, and you just click this off. This is perfect. Jim Venedies asks, what are you doing to help accreditation organizations shift their views? It seems that accreditation organizations drive institutional behavior, and that seems to perpetuate old school views of learning.
What am I doing? Well, I have gradually learned over the course of my career that things tend to work out better when I speak only where I've been invited. So I would love nothing more than to present this research and experience to accreditation organizations, because I fully agree with the premise of the question that, well, I wouldn't see it in binary terms that, to suggest we can't do anything until they change their criteria for accreditation. But surely it pushes things in the wrong direction, just as U.S. News and World Report does, and a number of other things. So I would be, you can take my writings or the writings of other people on whom I've relied and send them to the accreditation organizations, especially if you have contacts there, which, as far as I know, I don't.
We do. In fact, we've had two leaders of accreditation organizations on. Last week, we had the head of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, the Committee on Quality, who was brilliant.
We do know, by the way, just to stick for a moment with just the narrow grading issue, that there are colleges and universities that don't give grades and are fully accredited and get their students into graduate and professional schools and into workplaces. And these students, if anything, I believe, are doing better intellectually because of the absence of grades. The Alverno College for women in Wisconsin, New College in Florida, Evergreen in Washington State, Hampshire, which is on tenuous footing in Massachusetts, and a couple of others. So the idea that you can't get around grading at an institutional level is simply false. Just as high schools can and do get rid of grades and still get their students into universities. So often we shrug and say, our hands are tied, there's nothing we can do because of these larger constraints. And it turns out that's not entirely true.
I had a faculty member at one university tell me she was required by law, this is her expression, that she had to give a 4-hour lecture every week. Yeah. I mean, it's funny.
Or another sort of funny but not funny is when you expand the time that you have with students. So instead of having them for 50 minutes, you've got a 3-hour block, and the response is, "How am I going to lecture for 3 hours?" Yeah.
Again, we have 10 minutes, and I want to make sure that we hit some other topics that have just been coming in. Adam Tomaszewski has a great correction to make. He says not being tenure track doesn't only point to adjuncts. Many of us are term faculty on renewable lines. Quite true, Adam. Quite true. But we have two questions on technology. One from Bobby Baggio, who says, in my opinion, much of higher ed is low-level knowledge and fact-based. What role do you see AI playing in teaching and learning moving forward?
Wow, those are two interesting non sequitur-ish sentences. I agree with the first, and I think that's a problem I would address myself to without ever looking at AI, which I find more dystopian than anything else. But I don't know enough about how it could be applied to that and what the questioner has in mind for why those two things are related. But I think we could satisfactorily address the challenge of making higher education more about deep thinking and understanding than about merely acquiring skills and memorizing facts without ever asking a machine to do any part of that for us. Even if I'm missing out on some connection or positive contribution that AI might make, in other words, it is certainly not necessary to draw from AI in order to immediately address ourselves to trying to do stuff that is more substantive and higher order thinking.
Interesting, Bobby. If you'd like to say more, either just click the raised hand to join us, or pop on stage. Speaking of raised hands, we've got a couple of people who are brilliant who I'd like to bring on stage. One is George Station, coming to us from the California State University system, long-term friend of the program. Hello, George.
Hi, how are you? Okay, and because of our sound issues, is my voice okay?
It's perfect. It's really good.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Alfie, I've got a class at the top of the hour. You've ruined me for it, and so congratulations.
You're welcome.
And I want to say real quickly that my campus, our Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment, we do have a cohort with an ungrading conversation that actually just started. Chatted with Laura Gibbs for a while just a couple of weeks ago. So it started at our campus. So I'm going to take that as good news. My question for you today is about student involvement in developing learning outcomes, if you feel like that's a valid area. I'm at a 25-year-old university, fairly young, but we have these kind of rock solid university learning outcomes, major area learning outcomes, etc., course learning outcomes. How do we get students involved in this where they're not already involved, which is almost everywhere?
Well, I'm going to take a step back and question the premise of the question. I would want to know more about those outcomes before I ask how to get students involved in them. The problem may be with the specificity of the outcomes themselves, not just the fact that students are excluded from the process. The more specific and detailed and numerous the outcomes are, the more this is not about education anymore. It's just about training. There must be a degree of discretion, of open-mindedness, of improvisation. Great education is more like a jazz improvisation than it is like, simply a performance of something that has been composed in advance. And those outcomes, when they are multiple and specific, really represent an outgrowth of Skinnerian behaviorism, which is totally repudiated by, except for a small cult-like group of behavior analysts. Psychology has left them in the dust decades ago, but education continues to implement specific outcomes, mandates, testing, scope and sequence instruction, skills-based stuff, mastery learning, and all the rest that proceed from a set of behaviorist assumptions like that. So my first step is, how do we bring students and faculty in the process of reevaluating whether we are going nuts with these outcomes and benchmarks and the like, to maximize the opportunity for classrooms to go off in unexpected directions with only a broad set of parameters. And then the next question is, yes, at every level of not only method but goal, students' voices need to be a part of this. Not because, we're just seeing them as customers with that, marketplace model that people rightly decry, but because the whole point here is they're learning. And that means, students learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And benchmarks, outcomes, mandates, all of that stuff too often represents an approach where the students are just following directions. And maybe if we feel generous, we let them have a little say about which path they take to reach a preordained goal imposed on them. That doesn't help them become members of a democratic society or fully functioning human beings.
Oh, it's good for an authoritarian society.
Yeah, thanks. Because I'm actually want to take that to our Teaching, Learning, and Assessment Center and see where that discussion goes. Because I know that I'm in the Cal State system, so we're rock solid as far as some system-wide mandates, but also each campus has its own outcomes, and it's outcomes all the way down with the turtles. So,
Yeah.
so just challenging that in the first place is a big one. But I think some of that has to come from the students, because it's one of the few systems where I think they listen to students. I'll just wrap real quickly. Your comment about contract grading as a scaffold,
Yeah.
I'm actually going to take that back to our group, because we have some people who were seeing the solution being, oh boy, I can do contract grading and that'll get me there.
Or letting
didn't know how
students
to
do.
address it.
Right. I mean, there's a whole field of study within educational psychology that I will compress into a few seconds. It shows that the more you get students focused on how well they're doing, the less engaged they tend to be with what they're doing. And that means that even getting rid of grades completely, I saved this notice for the last 3 minutes, in case I haven't been sufficiently controversial or disorienting. Even getting rid of grades, you can't replace them with rubrics, because rubrics typically are just like grades on steroids, where there are even more degrees of gradation on more criteria, thus multiplying the harm that letter grades do. But even moving to something that's more authentic in terms of assessment, like narratives and portfolios and so on, performance, exhibitions of mastery, all the grade. There's a huge library of stuff on alternatives to grades and tests. But the point is that if students are still being led to take their own temperature, how am I doing? As Ed Koch, the old mayor of New York, used to stop people on the street and ask, hey, how am I doing? How am I doing? Which he apparently thought was endearing as opposed to deeply neurotic. If you turn students into Ed Koch's, constantly having to evaluate their own performance at tasks, they will tend to feel that they have less say over their learning and to be less engaged with the learning for its own sake. Most of the time, we need to move away from not only standards-based grading or students judging each other or students judging themselves or using other ways of communicating besides letters and numbers. We need to take a step back and say, are students being led to focus too much, too neurotically, too obsessively on their performance in the class? Because if so, it will undermine the learning. Most of the time, they should be completely engaged in the doing.
Okay, great. And thank you. And thanks, Bryan, for bringing me up to bring those several items up. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, George. Good luck with your class today.
Thanks.
We have time for one last question, and this is from the splendid Ophelia Mangan, who has a question maybe about AI. Let's take a look. Hello, Ophelia. Oh, we can't hear you. Your audio is off.
How fitting for a discussion of technology.
Oh, stop it. You should have on the top right of your screen, there should be a gear for settings. And one of those should be for your microphone.
Are we good now? Oh, fantastic. When the technologist has the challenges. But actually a question that I put in the box that I was being curious about is, so I am working at the Columbia Climate School, and we are very much in the process of becoming, we are a brand new school. And so I was curious if you had, what are a few things that you feel would be sort of essential for us to be able to live up to our goal, which is to ensure that we're preparing students to address the climate crisis.
I'm the wrong person to ask. I have opinions about this as a citizen, but no special expertise in the climate crisis or how best to teach it. Anything I would say to you would be generic that I would also offer to people who are doing teaching and learning around other issues and other topics. So I'd love to help you, but I don't think I have the background to be useful.
Yeah. Well, I know we're at time, but maybe what I'll sort of throw in there as a consideration too, it would just be to say, we need to be able to be quick. We need to be able to be effective. We need to be able to motivate, shift attitudes and behaviors. So I think a lot of things that you were talking about, how grading actually gets in the way of that, were some of the things that made me sort of want to float that question your way. and see what you would think in terms of, again, designing effective learning experiences that and a key part of what we're working on here is to actually connect that to direct impact and action that is resolving the climate crisis.
Right. There it accentuates the urgency, which all of us can see. But it just magnifies the importance of doing what we ought to be doing in all topics, which is bringing the students in on making these decisions and doing away with the kind of traditional approaches to instruction that may seem efficient at first glance, but actually are undermining the very things we're trying to promote.
In the chat, Ken Solanero just said students are completely motivated intrinsically around climate change.
Yes.
Her experience.
But an excellent way to destroy intrinsic motivation on that or anything else is to treat them like pets with rewards and punishments, over control and the like.
Well, we have been tasked with doing things differently, and I'm trying to live up to that. So I look forward to check out some more of your work. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being so speedy. Alfie, my gosh, this time just blasted by in far too quickly. You've been a terrific, terrific guest. I'm astonished at your passion, your energy, your wit, and your ability to compress an awful lot of learning and thought into just a few words and sentences. Is the best way to keep up with you your Alfie Kohn Twitter feed as well as with your website?
Yeah, the website for the more substantive pieces, but I tend to tweet one thought or link or quote a day on average, or joke. Yeah, I'm on Twitter, but mostly my website has got every article I've written since I was in 4th grade. It's all available for free, as well as information about the books and a couple of videos and stuff like that. Fantastic.
Thank you so much. The crowd is going wild in chat, and they want to bring you back, and we're going to try and bring you back. Thanks so much for being here, and good luck with all of your work.
Thank you. I appreciate your interest, and everyone for showing up.
Thank you. Friends, don't take off just yet. We need to point out where we're headed for the next few weeks, but I do want to thank all of you for this wonderful stream of questions and comments. Thank you all for engaging in such a great way without any lecturing or without any grades. Looking ahead to the next couple of months, just to remind you that if you go to forum.futureoferducation.us, you can see some of our topics, including federal policy changes, technology and academia, improving education equity for Black students, sparking emerging ed tech conversations, and the MTech MOOC. If you'd like to keep talking about these issues, how to improve teaching and learning, how to get rid of grades, destroy lectures, change the culture of teaching and learning, we have all kinds of ways of doing this. Twitter seems to be our special anchor for this right now, but as well, we have room on LinkedIn and Facebook. If you'd like to go back into the past and look at our previous sessions on ungrading or on lecturing or on changing teaching and learning, not to mention education and technology, just head to our archive, tinyurl.com/FTF archive. More than 250 recordings right now. In the meantime, thank you again for a terrific discussion. Everybody, good luck finishing up the spring. Good luck planning for the summer and fall. We'll keep working away at this. We'll see you next week, and we'll see you online. Bye-bye.